question I had this morning is from a member of the church. They were saying, we know that we refrain from using instruments as a collective group, but what about individually? When I'm on my own, what are your thoughts about listening or participating in instrumental music? First of all, if you're visiting with us here, wonderful to have you. And especially if you're not familiar with this, most churches probably aren't talking about refraining from using instruments in worship. It's not something that's on their radar. It's something that they would consider very primitive. And I'm not just making that up. I was reading about that this week. Very, very primitive. I actually don't take offense at that. There are no bad questions. If you got a question, we want to answer this. I'm going to give you both sides to this, and I'm going to tell you where I'm at in my studies. As always, for example, I can't imagine myself ever preaching that baptism is not for the forgiveness of sins. I feel like at this point, for example, I've heard about every argument, but that does not mean that I am closed ears. I'll always listen to someone, and I'm always willing to go back and relook at something. So when it comes to this topic, I'm willing to go back and look at it. Let's start with, first of all, the main New Testament passages pertaining to our worshiping to God in that music arena, if you will. Now, these aren't the only ones I want to tell you right now. We've got some also in Revelation. I've not included those because they're symbolic. They're not literal representations of the worship that's happening here on earth. There are things that go on in the heavenly realm that do not pertain to us here and vice versa. And I'm just going to suffice it to say that anyone who's looking at this with any amount of intellectual honesty will see that. So we've got passages like Ephesians 5, right? Paul writes to the church of Ephesus, and do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. This is actually something they can do, that they're instructed to do. Yes, you can be totally filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. He also writes to the church in Colossae, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. We're doing that. We've already done that this morning. Let's not forget that whenever we're singing, we are teaching and admonishing. That's an interesting one as well. Sometimes we don't think about admonishing, but there can even be correction in our teaching, in our singing. Okay? 1 Corinthians, this is the context where their worship had become chaos. There is no debate about it. This is the context of a local assembly where they had spiritual gifts. In particular, in chapter 14, people had the gifts of speaking in tongues, and they were doing it in a very chaotic way. They didn't have interpreters. People didn't know what was being said. They were talking over each other, and he's putting everything into order. At one portion of that context, Paul says, what am I to do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will also pray with my mind. I will sing praise with my spirit, but I will sing with my mind also. Now, again, in the context, he's talking about the relevance of actually knowing what's being said, but he's talking about singing. 1 Corinthians 14, same passage. What then, brothers? When you come together, so this is a local assembly, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. And then finally, James 5:13. This is the title of the sermon. Is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing praise. So argument number one goes like this. And it's not complicated at all. You look at the New Testament passages, this is what we have. What's the common denominator? They're all singing. Instruments are not mentioned. Therefore, instruments are an addition. That's the thought process. We know that they were used in the Old Testament. We understand that. But Jesus Christ fulfilled the law. And there are many things that you read about in the Old Testament that did not transfer over to the New Covenant. Therefore, the silence is not a coincidence. It's purposeful, and there it is. We do not use instruments. That's the argument. Here's the other side of the argument. They believe it's implied whenever you know the history, the background of the people you were writing to. For example, there's actually debate in Ephesians 5:18 and 19, when it says addressing one another in psalms. There's discussion around the term psalms, and what they discuss is this. By the New Testament time, whenever you read the term psalm, did that imply instruments or not? They have all of that discussion. If you go to definitions of it, if you just look at the definition, it's going to include instruments. And then you're going to have the phrase singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart. There's a whole other different discussion around the Greek term solo, because it means to pluck. And so some people are going, what it means to pluck? That's a throwback to instruments. But the other side says, but to pluck is the original concept. But it can mean to pluck what? Well, the instrument is your heart. So you're not plucking an instrument, you're plucking the strings of your heart. I'm going to tell you that this is what I'm going to, I've heard the arguments for not using, or for using instruments. And to me, they're not strong. I'm going to give you what I would put forward if I were to argue the other side. If you're asking me talk about this, I went back to square one and I'm trying to look at this with fresh eyes, and here's how I would argue the other side, okay? I would take you to Psalms, and I would say, okay, so for example, Psalm 33, shout for joy in the Lord, O you righteous, praise befits the upright. Give thanks to the Lord with the lyre, make melody to him with the harp of 10 strings, sing to him a new song, play skillfully on the strings with loud shouts. And I would say, it is true here. Now on this one, you're making melody on a harp, so I'll give you that one. But you are singing. But maybe someone goes, I don't know. Okay, Psalm 57, 7 through 8. My heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody. Now, there's your singing and making melody to the Lord. I will sing and make melody. Awake, my glory. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. So to sing and make melody to the Lord in that passage does not mean that an instrument wasn't used. You can sing and make melody, but they still had an instrument. Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. Now, in this psalm, there's no mentioning of instruments. Should we conclude then that you can't use instruments? And I would say, no, there'd have to be context and harmony. There are other passages that talk about instruments. My heart is steadfast, O God. I will sing and make melody with all my being. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. So you can have someone in these passages that is making melody with all their being, but they did have a harp and lyre. If I was on that side of the fence, I would look at something like 1 Chronicles 15, 16. David also commanded the chiefs of the Levites to appoint their brothers as the singers who should play loudly on musical instruments or on harps and lyres and cymbals to raise sounds of joy. The singers even did what? So here's the rub. Here's the rub. One side is saying, okay, yeah, but did you notice how in all the passages that you just referenced, they mentioned a harp? They mentioned a lyre? You're not having to assume any. They're in the text. And David in all this worship, by the way, he was told by Nathan the prophet, he was given instruction. He was given instruction how to do that. Don't you see that? And then the other side answers, yes, we see that. But whenever you consider the audience that he's writing to, whenever they sing and make melody, I don't know that that necessarily means they could use instruments, because I got Psalms that say that, and instruments were being used. And if you consider the people that use the instruments, I think I would absolutely, in other words, if we were Ephesus and we always used instruments, and I read that letter, and you see sing and make melody to the Lord with all your heart, would you turn around and be like, did y'all notice that? We can't use instruments anymore. They're going, I don't buy that. Because whenever you consider the audience, so you got this rub. Are you with me? There's the rub on this thing. I'm going to tell you where I'm at. And I'm going to tell you, whenever I study this, something that has been very, very significant to me. And we're going to have to get into our history. So I don't typically, and I'm just going to tell you right now, I don't have a problem saying this. I do not have, this is not cherry picking history. What I'm about to share with you is unchallenged. Is unchallenged. And this to me plays a part in how I am interpreting passages like Ephesians 5 or James chapter 5. So I've got these up on the board here. Either read along, but I've got notes. Would you bear with me? You don't always have the time that I do. You're supporting me, and I'm going to tell you this is the kind of research I got to do. Here it is. The New Testament does not indicate the musical forms or instruments that the early church used. Again, that depends on how you're reading the text, but let's go with it. Converts from Judaism likely would have continued to sing the kinds of worship songs they were accustomed to. As Hill notes, it is only natural then that we seek the origins of early Christian worship in Jewish temple and synagogue worship. Hang on with me. I'm going to clear some of this up. The establishment of synagogues wherever the Jews were found in sufficient numbers helped greatly to keep alive Israel's hope of the coming of the Messiah and to prepare the way for the spread of the gospel in other lands. The worship of the Christian church was afterwards modeled after that of the synagogue. Y'all ever heard of like Bible.ca? Bible.ca? You'll go to his page and you can look at instruments, and he's going to have a whole deal. And the first thing he starts with is a prototype of synagogues being a prototype of the church. I don't disagree with him. The more you study and you learn about the history, and this is not, so I'm not trying to, I'm just saying, guys, synagogues is all over the New Testament and the New Testament passages. Whenever you look and you learn into the synagogues, you are going to learn that was a thing. The New Testament church, the local fellowships, it looks like they just carried on. We're getting into the setting of a Jewish Christian 2,000 years ago and what they were used to and accustomed to, okay? And so what I want to discuss is synagogues. What we learn about synagogues, as I put in here, we learn a lot from Talmudic writings. Do you know that synagogues had local autonomy? Like we do? They didn't have sister churches. They didn't have a plurality of elders. Oh, they had elders. Guys, did you know that synagogues had elders? Did you know that they would exercise discipline? They were centered mostly on the reading of God. Do you know whenever Paul told Timothy to commit himself to the public reading of Scripture? Because that's what they did in synagogues. Whenever Jesus went into the synagogue, you remember they handed him the scroll? They had a moving table with all the scrolls. They had seating for everyone, and they would read it. Okay. If you're interested, do some more research into it. Really, really interesting, at least to me. While the Jewish rabbis considered music an art form for the praise of God, and the Greek philosophers thought of it as a powerful moral force in creation, the Romans considered music mainly as entertainment. The music of the Roman games was neither religious nor philosophic, and, from the accounts of witnesses, it was not technically exceptional. In the Roman Empire, musicians were given a lower status and looked on as mere entertainers. One reason the early church did not include instrumental music in their worship was in reaction to the debased secular use of instruments by the Romans. Now, this is a church historian and who's focusing in on music, which, by the way, does not believe that it's wrong to use instruments in worship. He continues on. The New Testament says little about music as part of Christian worship, but unlike some of the more zealous reformers, okay, now I'm going to slow down on this one. So whenever you have those that break from Catholicism, the Reformation movement, so now you got big names like Calvin and Luther, heavy hitters. We're going back to like the 1500s, okay? Let me read this again. The New Testament says little about music as part of a Christian worship, but unlike some of the more zealous reformers who interpreted this as an indication that music should not be part of worship, the New Testament must be looked in light of the Old Testament. The apostles were active in temple and synagogue worship and certainly did not abandon the musical forms of Jewish culture. However, the early church under persecution was unable to sustain a complicated musical liturgy since Christians often met in secret and in their homes. Let me tell you what's happened here. So like if I'm in the realm of apologetics and someone says, I know the Bible says that Jesus lived, but give me some sources outside of the Bible that talk about him being alive. I can give that to you. And I can give you material that were written by Christian haters, but they talk about Jesus being crucified by Pilate. What they did is they're confirming, so he did live. This guy doesn't believe that it's wrong to use instruments, but in all of his research, he is confirming something consistently. And you know what it was? The synagogues, they did not use instruments, and the New Testament church did not use instruments. Let me continue on. I'll wrap this up, at this section at least. Music historians have long since made note of the contrast between the elaborate instrumentally accompanied psalmody of the temple and the simple vocal, that is, non-instrumental psalmody of the synagogue. They assumed that the absence of instruments from the synagogue was the result of a deliberate legal act and spoke of the prohibitions and banishments. Here's a final one on this. Instruments were not used in the worship of the ancient synagogue. They belonged to the tabernacle and the temple, especially the latter, but were never in the congregational assemblies of God's people. Brethren, this is unchallenged history. So here's what I need to stress. The first century church, before it was established, was already used to meeting weekly in temples. They met weekly, actually 2 to 3 times a week, many times. They were already meeting in synagogues, local synagogues with leadership. You could tell someone from which synagogue you belong to. Paul had to go to synagogues to get permit, all that kind of stuff. They were in the practice of meeting weekly, and among that they would sing, and they did not use instruments. This guy is saying he thinks it was done because they had a dislike of Roman culture or they were afraid. I don't buy that, and let me tell you why. The Jews had instruments. They didn't shy away from using instruments whenever pagans were all around them. And as far as them trying to basically keep quiet, I want you to imagine. So if Jews were all using instruments, and now you're a Christian and you're using instruments, there's no difference. And the songs that you're singing are the same songs that they've been singing, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. You wouldn't stand out. And even if do you understand what I'm saying? Someone's going along the streets and they hear someone singing a song and they're using instruments and it sounds like a Jewish song. Are they Jewish or Christian? Unless you're trying to say, well, they try to keep something Christ out of it. And now what we start getting to is that we have this not meek, but a fearful Christian group. And they're not letting anyone know that they're Christians. Because here's another thought. You're worshiping God and you using instruments isn't the only thing that's going to give you away that you're a Christian. So if you're trying to run from God, run from persecution, then you're telling no one that you're Christian. And I just want to ask you, read your New Testament pages. Is that the feel that you get? Is that Peter? Is that Paul? No, I don't buy that. What you're having is a guy that's looking at the facts of historical information and he's trying to give his 2 cents as to why they weren't doing that. Because if you can say, well, they only weren't doing it because they didn't want to look like the pagans or they didn't want to be persecuted, but they weren't doing it because they weren't supposed to be doing, see, then later on you can do it. I'm just not buying that. Did you know that whenever we talk about the term a cappella, that means without instrumental accompaniment. That is a Latin phrase that means in chapel style. So whenever someone today says, oh yeah, it's an a cappella group, that means an in chapel style group. In chapel style, what does that got to do anything? Well, because for the first pretty much 1,000 years, no one who gathered together to worship God was using instruments. Now that needs to sink in a little bit. In the first century, if you went to temple worship in Jerusalem, yes, they used instruments. If you got together weekly, no instruments. This was so common that we have a phrase for it, a cappella, in chapel style. The first time instruments were introduced was by a pope in the 7th century. This is they go between the 7th or 8th century, who introduced an organ at one point in one of the locations. And let me tell you two things. It didn't make everyone happy, and it was not widely accepted. What we're just trying to point out is that you're not even hearing an instrument for literally hundreds of years. Today, you have 225 to 300 million Orthodox Christians. These are individuals that back in 1054 split from Catholicism over various issues, one of the main ones being, guess what? Instrumental music. They split. So in the West, you're an oddball if you don't use instruments. In the East, it's very normal for people not to use instruments. And today, they still worship without instruments. Did you know that denominations really weren't using instruments until about the late 1700s? So, you've got this one, again, you got your church historian. The early reformers, when they came out of Rome, removed them as the monuments of idolatry. They're talking about instrumental instruments. Luther called the organ an ensign of Bel. Calvin said that instrumental music was not fitter to be adopted into the Christian church than the incense and the candlestick. I'll get to that in a second. Knox called the organ a kiss of whistles. The Church of England revived them against a very strong protest, and the English dissenters would not touch them. So now I want to read some heavy hitters in the history of the Protestant movement. So you've got Adam Clarke. So this is a representation of the Methodist denomination. Adam Clarke, again, theologian, Bible scholar, this was his quote. I'm an old man, and I here declare that I never knew them to be productive of any good in the worship of God, and have reason to believe that they are productive of much evil. Music as a science I esteem and admire, but instrumental music in the house of God I abominate and abhor. This is the abuse of music, and I here register my protest against all such corruption of the worship of the author of Christianity. The late and venerable and most eminent divine, the Reverend John Wesley, Methodist, who was a lover of music and an elegant poet, when asked his opinion of instruments of music being introduced into the chapels of the Methodists, said in his terse and powerful manner, I have no objections to instruments of music in our chapels, provided they are neither heard nor seen. I say the same. John Knox. So that was the Methodist Church. Well, now you're getting into the Presbyterian. I'm talking about major denominations here. And by the way, I'm not trying to pick on anybody. You're misreading me. It's not what I'm doing. I'm talking about the history. What do we know about this? So when you're looking at the Presbyterian Church, they typically are attributing them being founded on John Knox and John Calvin. John Knox, again, Knox considered the organ the devil's kiss to whistles. That's funny. And had the one organ in the High Kirk of Edinburgh removed. Here, this second one right here, you can see this is Questions at the Confession of Faith and form of government of the Presbyterian Church. Notice the year, 1842. Here's the question. Is there any authority for instrumental music in the worship of God under the present dispensation? Answer, not the least. Only the singing of psalms and hymns and spiritual songs was appointed by the apostles. Not a syllable is said in the New Testament in favor of instrumental music, nor was it ever introduced into the church until after the 8th century. And now you're going to start seeing some common denominators. They start pulling to the history. After the Catholics had corrupted the simplicity of the gospel by their carnal inventions. It was not allowed in the synagogues, the parish churches of the Jews, but was confined at the temple service and was abolished with the rites of that dispensation. They borrowed it from the Jews. The Catholics did that. The crazy thing is that Catholics went from the Gregorian chant, not harmony. Matter of fact, brethren, do you know the Catholic Church, they didn't even have harmony. And eventually they worked their way into harmony. And then their harmonies became very sophisticated. And then at one point they said, we need to be careful because the point of singing is to teach and admonish one another. And when we got it getting too fancy, and maybe we even need to listen to this, can you understand what's being said? Can you be taught? So they went from Gregorian chants to eventually instrumental music. John Knox knew his history. So did the other guys. John Calvin. French theologian, Calvinism, guys, John Calvin. Musical instruments in celebrating the praises of God would be no more suitable than the burning of incense, the lighting of lamps, and the restoration of the other shadows of the law. The Papists, therefore, have foolishly borrowed this as well as many other things from the Jews. Many who are fond of outward pomp may delight in that noise, but the simplicity which God recommends to us by the apostles is far more pleasing to him. Paul allows us to bless God in the public assembly of the saints only in a known tongue. And now he quotes 1 Corinthians 14:16. What shall we say of chanting, which fills the ears with nothing but an empty sound? I do want to make one personal note, though. And I want to make this super clear. I do not think a good argument for using for practicing a cappella is by judging the motives of people that use instruments. If you're not careful, you're going to condemn all those faithful people in the Old Testament. Well, whenever you use instruments, you were just about being showboaty. Are you ready to say that? You were using instruments and you weren't sincere. You ready to say that about David? Be very careful about your argumentation. I don't care about any of that. And I'll tell you right now, this has no weight to it. I'm just trying to make the point. I'm a musician. So some of you say, a cappella, there's nothing better than it. I'm like, we'll agree to disagree on that. I agree, if you're listening to the Eagles, Seven Bridge Road, what is that? What is it? When do you know it? Yeah, Seven Bridges Road. Thank you, Joel. I'm shocked. Listen, whenever they stop and they go into a little harmony section, I agree. It's awesome. But no, I like instruments. It's irrelevant what I like. We got to be careful of that. Martin Luther. The Lutheran Church, brother. The organ in the worship is the insignia of Baal, a sign of the devil. The Roman Catholics borrowed it from the Jews. Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Baptist, Charles Spurgeon. He says, we do not need them, instruments in worship. They would hinder rather than help our praise. Sing unto him. This is the sweetest and best music. No instrument like the human voice. What a degradation to supplant the intelligent song of the whole congregation by the theatrical prettiness of a quartet, bellows, and pipes. We might as well pray by machinery as praise by it. He was a bit of a wordsmith, in case you can't tell. When asked why, he quoted 1 Corinthians 14:15. I will pray with the Spirit, and I will pray with the understanding also. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the understanding also. He preached to 20,000 people every Sunday in the Metropolitan Baptist Tabernacle. They never allowed instruments in there. It wasn't that long ago. My question is, It's pretty super consistent. No instrument, no instrument, no instrument. And even those of the Reformation movement were like, it's not authorized. And then all of a sudden, boom, it's everywhere. You answer me, what changed? Us or God's word? So here's where I'm at. The New Testament passages do mention instruments, something or nothing. You can look at that, and can you understand, here's, I guess, my question. Trying to be objective, can you understand how someone could look at that and say, I know you're saying that we're assuming for using them, but I think you're assuming on your part that just because they're not mentioned, you may be assuming it's wrong. Because I'm considering my audience and passages like that in the Old Testament. What I'm saying is that I can understand that. But whenever I begin to look at my history, and I know that the synagogues didn't use them, and I know that it looks pretty much like they carried on the form of a synagogue into the first century church, I started realizing, my girls asked me a few months back for the first time, they said, Dad, why don't we use instruments? And I said, well, some people, and I quoted a couple of these passages, they look at that and they go, since they're not mentioned, we shouldn't use them. Other people think, though, that it's implied that no one would have taken that away. I said, but what I know is that we just know for a fact that no instruments are being used in the first century, and they had instruments all the time in the Old Testament, and so all of a sudden they're just gone. And I said, what do you guys think about that? And I believe it was Braylon says, well, it seems like maybe someone told them to stop using them. Out of the mouth of babes. She's no scholar. But actually, even that, with the way I presented it, was not accurate. You know, I've struggled for a while before I understood the synagogue side. Here's my personal confession that I was struggling with. If they were all using instruments, and then immediately all of a sudden it stopped, which every scholar agrees, that like there was no instruments in the first century, that would have been such an abrupt deal. Why don't we see Paul ever telling someone, don't use them? Does that make sense? Like, you would need to tell me, because I would just assume we could use them. But then as I study more, I realized, well, he didn't need to, because they already weren't using them. If they only used them in the temple, but they were already accustomed to gathering weekly in the synagogues, not using instruments, there's nothing new to instruct. And so now when you ask me the question, well, context and harmony, hermeneutics, okay, well, that means knowing my audience in context and harmony. Well, what I know about my audience is that they weren't accustomed to using instruments. So this, to me, where I'm at, has a lot of weight when I'm reading these New Testament passages. Does that make sense? So I cannot, by faith, worship God when we come together collectively using instruments. I can't do that. I'm open to talking to people, but I'm not seeing that. I could not do that in good faith. That's where I'm at. And I've got way too much history on that one. Sean, what about individually? I don't have as much information individually on what they were doing that makes me feel comfortable. So I'm going to tell you where I'm at. I don't do it individually, but I'm trying to be transparent with you, and it doesn't mean that my reasoning is correct. I'm trying to have some integrity that what I would tell you in my home, I will say from the pulpit. Okay? I don't do that. But I do want to caution you. If your main and only argumentation is based on the silence of scriptures and history is of no significance to you, I do want to encourage some consistency, because those passages that I read at the beginning include both collective and personal settings. So if your main argumentation is, I don't use instruments because of the silence of scriptures, then I would assume you don't use them collectively or individually. That's it. That's all I got for you this morning. I appreciate your attention. I'm not going to be offended if you think that was horrible and you take me to task outside. That's fine. Just, be kind. But that's where I'm at. God bless you as you do your own study on that. Let's stand and sing praises to God.